She's a University of Nottingham Rights Lab Associate Director on Ecosystems and Environment Program and Assistant Professor of Anti-Slavery Ecosystems. I've got her resume here, and I'm not going to read it all to you, but I'm pretty sure that she is the most academically accomplished person and most academically published person in this room. Please forgive me if someone else is more, but I think her curriculum is very, very impressive. So Jessica, please.
So good morning. It was very kind of Maria to say that. But actually, in preparing for today, it was a bit intimidating because I want to acknowledge that in this room, you all are actually the experts. I'm honestly not sure what I could say today that many or most of you don't already know, as you all have the lived experience of being there with the fishers every single day. I think it was almost 7 years ago to the day that, if I recall, I was working on my PhD research about labor abuses and working conditions in fisheries, and I met an ITF inspector here in the UK named Liam Wilson. Yeah, I hear the laughing from the UK too. And if you know Liam, Liam told me about his good friend Joe. He actually told me about his good friend Joe for about 3 hours. And so, again, everyone who knows Liam understands. And he was actually talking about Joe O'Donnell, who was the chaplain of Apostleship of the Sea for Scotland up here. And so Liam started telling me about all the amazing work that Stella Maris and Deacon Joe were doing to assist migrant workers in the fishing sector. So for the past 7 years, I've been fortunate and privileged to consider Stella Maris one of my closest collaborators and partners. So as an academic, I of course stuck at a university doing research, but I'm a former social worker and often blend the two to be sort of like a researcher activist. And in working with Stella Maris, we've actually really started to affect change, in my opinion. So here in the UK, a couple months ago, back in May, I authored a report called Letting Exploitation Off the Hook, Evidencing Labor Abuses in the UK Industry. It got pretty good coverage. It sparked a lot of anger in the industry for telling the truth. But in collaboration with Stella Maris, the Seafarers Charity, ITF, we now know that the NCA is inspecting migrant workers' contracts for recruitment fees for the first time. So they're trying to track debt, which is illegal because the UK is a party to ILOC 188. We also know that they are working to end the transit visa, which is an exploited visa scheme that Stella Maris has written about extensively, and that they are using an element of the Modern Slavery Act for the first time to make sure that as we transition migrants to skilled worker visas, that they're gonna not be treated as illegal immigrants. Instead, they're gonna charge fishing vessel owners who are using the transit visa illegally, they're going to charge them with forced criminal exploitation, which means that migrants will actually not incur any immigration penalties. So all of that success is because of this phenomenal partnership that we've been able to build. So today, I've already talked about that a lot in a lot of forums. So today, I'm really excited to talk about a bigger piece of work that many in this room helped with, where we actually replicated the research on a much more global scale. So to start, putting research that puts fishers first, a little bit about me is that I believe that fishers should be at the table. And as an academic, I've seen a lot of academics that want the easy way out. They think that technology or using satellites on vessels to predict where forced labor is going to be the panacea that ends fishing abuses or abuses in the fishing sector. And the reality is how can we understand what's happening if we don't talk to the fishers themselves? As an academic, despite what Maria said, I'm not prolifically published at all because I'd rather make sure that that data gets in the hands of people who need it, and I'd rather take the time to overcome the challenges to make sure that fishers are at the table and that we have their experiences centered in everything we do. So I like to call that Fisher First research. So for the past 10 months, globally, we embarked on surveying fishers all around the world, thanks to Stella Mara's chaplains. So they helped along with the International Transport Workers Federation, and we surveyed over 2,000 fishers worldwide. So that was done anonymously in person with chaplains and also online. Sorry, I keep having to turn my head. The anonymity makes it a little bit challenging to make the research actionable in that we don't have vessel names, but that was also on purpose because we know that there's a lot of mistrust, and so we wanted to get a much more in-depth understanding of what was happening with the fishers, and that we can look at patterns globally that are still actionable without knowing specific vessel names. The survey was translated into 23 languages, so we hoped that even if someone was helping the fisher take it by reading it to them, that the ability to see their own language would actually help build trust and make them more comfortable in the process. In total, we had 92 questions, which was a lot of questions. But it means that we have a really phenomenal data set that might actually be one of the largest data sets on fishers' experiences collected in a systematic way. So we looked at 9 main topics. The first one was just demographics, like age, how long they had been fishing, etc. We looked at their pre-departure experiences, which was mostly about their recruitment debt, but also how did they find out about the job? Were they using formal recruitment networks? Were they using informal or a combination of the two? We looked at their contracts to see discrepancies between what they were promised and what materialized when they were on the boat, and if they even had a contract, or if that contract contained the minimum elements that it is supposed to. We looked at wages and salary, at the general working conditions on board. We also asked about accommodations. So what were the living conditions like? What about food, water, etc.? Safety, of course, vessel behaviors, because I think it's really interesting to think about when we use satellite data to track vessels, can we actually use that for forced labor or not? And we also looked at labor rights. So the premise of the survey was predicated on a couple legally binding instruments. So on the spectrum of working conditions, we have decent work, which is really great. That's what everyone is entitled to as a human being. So in fishing, decent work is covered by ILO C-188, the Work in Fishing Convention, which those of you working in fishing are probably really familiar with. It's really great as it sets minimum standards, definitely room for improvement, but it sets minimum standards for the first time around work in the fishing industry. Unfortunately, it has not been widely ratified. But as we go down the spectrum, I like to break it into 4 big chunks. So there's decent work, and then there's labor abuses. These may be things like wage disparities. So, for example, here in the UK, our national share fishermen make significantly more money than our migrant workers. So we have unequal pay for equal work, although in some cases, migrant fishers may be doing even more work. Those wage disparities are actually not illegal. Okay? So it doesn't even rise to the threshold of exploitation. It's what we call a labor abuse. Moving down the spectrum into labor exploitation, this may be where you start to get a couple different manifestations. So you might have that unequal pay, you might start having excessive working hours, and you might have tied visa regimes like we have with the transit visa. We see these tied visa regimes all around the world where basically a worker is tied to a vessel or to an employer, and it takes a lot of control and power away from them. And then, of course, at the far end of the spectrum, we have forced labor, modern slavery, debt bondage, all those things, and we used the standards in the Forced Labor Convention and the Palermo Protocol to help develop our questions. So a lot of research in this space will often take a binary approach. Yes, it's forced labor, or no, it's not. And the problem with that, in practicality, in my opinion, is that we start defining decent work by the absence of its antithesis, forced labor. But that's not necessarily decent work, right? Because there's a lot of things in this spectrum before we get to decent work. So in our global survey of about 2,000 participants, we found about 11% of fishers met those conditions for forced labor, human trafficking, and modern slavery. But as you can see, most fishers are clustered in the middle, and we have very few surveys that met all the elements of decent work. What this means is it's not that fishing's a bad job or a dirty job. It's work that people are really proud of and culturally important, and it should be that way. But we've normalized a lot of bad practices as just being fishing culture. And so I think that's the value of breaking it down and looking at it this way. Because so many people want to focus on that really egregious end. And we've all heard those cases. They're horrific, they're heartbreaking. I know I was sitting back with Father Jans, who has a whole text message stream of case after case. But the reality is we need to help change the norms and the working conditions for all the people in the middle who don't have decent work. So in the survey, we had 78 different nationalities respond to the survey. So this map doesn't cover it very well because it doesn't have the granularity for a lot of the Pacific Island states. Of course, Filipino migrant fishers, Indonesian migrant fishers were quite prominent. But what really surprised me was the spectrum of nationalities that were seen on board vessels. At the same time, we also had a question to ascertain how many other people from their nationality was on board the vessel. The 10 months of this study involved some stricter COVID restrictions, but also the easing up of COVID restrictions. So it's hard to tell if the diversity of nationalities was in part due to COVID restrictions or if it's starting to be intentional. So some of the things that came out in the survey, even though it had lots of closed-ended questions, people really liked writing things on the side to tell me more information, which can be overwhelming when you're trying to digitize 2,000 handwritten surveys, but it was a wealth of information. And one of the things that I'm concerned about with the increasing number of nationalities on board the vessel is A, solidarity amongst the crew, because you can have 5 or 6 different nationalities, particularly on the tuna vessels. And not that there's tension between them, but they're also not communicating or trying to help with each other. There are language barriers. But also, for Stella Maris, what challenges does this present in port? Many of you have built impressive communities of volunteers, which are present in this room with you. I was talking to Aldrin at break, as part of the Filipino community in Northern Ireland, and a volunteer there. And we are increasingly seeing Ghanaians in the Northern Ireland sector. So how do we build a force of volunteers that are going to be able to connect with these fishers? How do we overcome those language barriers? I know early on I heard from Father Rico in Cape Town, South Africa, and he had a Malagasy fisher on board a tuna vessel who was by himself, was quite isolated, and was having a really difficult experience. And it was a challenge to find a Malagasy interpreter in order to meet and speak with that fisher in the moment. So I think it's interesting to think about the increasing number of nationalities that we're seeing on board vessels. I think for us in the UK, there's also been a challenge of sometimes less experienced people coming over as we get new nationalities. And what does that mean for safety on board the vessel? Oh, I skipped a slide. Somehow I lost a slide, which isn't surprising. But also we had over 80 flag states and over 80 countries with ports that these vessels were visiting. So again, this is a very globalized industry. Nationality was not associated, so when we did statistical analyses, nationality was not associated with likelihood of ending up in forced labor or in exploitative practice. But what was statistically showing a relationship was this precarious immigration status. So I've been tied to visa regimes where they're tied to a single employer and they can't change jobs, or they're tied to an employer and they have to live on the vessel because they have no immigration right to enter a country. We see that in lots of places in the world, or no immigration status. So there are a couple surveys actually from men from a couple different African countries, but also a couple of men from Mauritius who are on Australian vessels. Now, Australia has a phenomenal requirements in their immigration scheme for fishers, especially migrant fishers. They actually have to level up their salary at the end of the year to make sure it's on par with national fishers. But because these men were being picked up in ports and dropped off in ports and never entered Australia, they weren't working on that immigration scheme. Now that could have been a quirk of COVID, or it could be that operators are starting to learn loopholes, for lack of better words. So in that case, you can end up on a vessel where you actually have no immigration status. And no immigration status for the ports that you're visiting, which could also, we've heard, restrict your access to Stella restrict your access to port services. So those with precarious immigration status, they were 6 times more likely to experience poor working conditions, and they were 34 times more likely to experience the really extreme end, because it gives control to vessel owners and to skippers, and it takes power away from them. There's my nationality slide. So I already covered over 80 nationalities, or 80 port states. So one of the things that we wanted to do with the data is there's lots of assumptions out there about what poor working conditions are related to in fisheries, what they look like, etc. And some of these assumptions, you actually cannot find data to support them. It's just based on some anecdotal observations that have sort of become like fact because they've been said so often. So because we had such a robust data set, we actually wanted to try and use statistics to test those assumptions. So flags of convenience. We hear lots about flags of convenience, and the finding in lay terms is that it's complicated. And it's complicated, I'm just gonna beat my way out of everything. It's complicated because there are certainly flags of convenience that we all know. We all know about the practice of, owners in one country flagging their vessel to a completely different country that isn't going to apply the regulations. But it gets complicated because we have labor abuses going on everywhere in the world. This is not just a problem in low-income countries or their fisheries. I'm American by birth. We have labor issues in the Hawaiian tuna longline fleet that look a whole lot like what's happening here in the UK. We of course have labor issues in the UK fleet. In the UK fleet, we have UK flagged vessels that are Spanish owned. We call those the Spanish Anglo trawlers. We also have the Dutch Anglo trawlers. Those vessels are flagged to the UK. They bring their crew in through the UK, so they don't have to comply with minimum wage laws in Spain, for example. But then they never come back to the UK. And it's the UK's responsibility to inspect those vessels. And we know that very rarely does the NCA go and inspect those vessels. Same thing with Ireland. We have a lot of UK flagged vessels that will go to Ireland and don't come back to the UK for many, many months. They just keep going to Ireland, and they switch crews by plane. Not their crew, sorry, they switch skippers by plane. So the skipper will fly home, they'll fly in a new skipper, that migrant crew is stuck on that vessel, and it never gets inspected because the vessel's in Ireland. So flags of convenience are complicated because we have the traditional flags of convenience that we think about, but we also have other states that are shirking their inspection and regulatory responsibilities. Transshipment, also complicated. That's because we know that really bad labor practices like forced labor, they are statistically related to transshipment. It's higher risk for lots of reasons. Those vessels aren't coming into port very often. Sometimes the crew get changed on those vessels. But also, the folks who have really good working conditions that we would call decent work, that was also related to transshipment. So they were having a positive experience with transshipment. And that transshipment was a way that they could access medical care. It was a way that they were accessing satellite coverage to contact friends, families, etc. And so it's complicated when we talk about transshipment. And from the environmental perspective, of course, there's lots of energy about transshipment bans. But from a labor perspective, I think some people do use transshipment for positive things. And also, what's going to happen when vessels are forced to come in and they're paying more money on fuel? There's not a lot of costs that they can cut. They often defer to cutting labor costs. So if we start enacting transshipment bans, what is that going to do to crew wages, which are already quite low? IUU fishing, it's complicated. It's a thing. My next one is complicated. Basically, IUU fishing and labor abuses are highly correlated. They're highly related in some areas of the world, and other areas of the world they're not. That's because labor abuses are much more pervasive than IUU fishing. So you can have labor abuses in really highly environmentally regulated fisheries that have less IUU fishing. So this finding is much more about the region and regulations in the region. One of my big concerns about those who want to use satellites, which is just monitoring the vessel behavior, to try and determine if there's forced labor on board, is that crew treatment is not homogeneous. And you all know that. We've talked about that with the different nationalities on board a vessel. And so we tested that, and because there's enough similarities in surveys that we can ascertain who's probably coming from a similar vessel. And you can have people on that vessel who say they're having a great experience, and you can have people on that vessel who are having a terrible experience. Part of it is because of racism, quite honestly, and how we treat people who are different than us. Part of it is also tied to not everyone on the vessel uses the same recruitment agency. So those recruitment, how they started their process to boarding this vessel was very different, and you can get a lot of diversity there as well. High seas, see, very definitive answers here. High seas are riskier than inshore waters. Actually not true. There's a lot of risk in inshore waters as well in terms of short haul fleets. This is not just happening on the high seas. Similar industrial vessels and small scale vessels, that's not even legally defined anywhere what the difference between the two is. But just thinking purely of the size of the vessel, there are actually some examples of really good, decent working conditions on really large vessels, in part because they have the crew, so they can appropriately rest. On really small vessels, we see really small crew numbers. With the small vessels, what we're also seeing with fish stock declines in particular, that they're fishing longer, further, deeper. And so what happens is vessels that historically might have only been a day trip or a 1 or 2 day trip, maybe going out for 5 or 6 days. These vessels don't actually have accommodations on board. So in Peru, many of their smaller scale vessels for squid fishing, they used to only fish for a day and they never stayed overnight. We now know that those vessels are staying out for 4 or 5 days at a time, and that people have to sleep on mats on the deck because there's no sleeping quarters. In the UK, many of our vessels lack washing facilities. So the migrant crew and even the domestic crew can't actually wash until they come into port. So some of the use of the risk in these small-scale vessels is actually due to other external factors, for example, environmental and climate change. And as Father Bruno always says, every time he speaks in my class, have to remember that fishing vessels were meant to haul and store fish. They're not actually meant to haul and store people. Also, with ILO C-188, the regulations for the fishing industry globally, the requirements for accommodations, there are actually exemptions. If you're not a new vessel, there's an exemption based on your size. So the accommodations piece is not well addressed in 188, in my opinion. Another big finding was, sorry, I'm just keeping track of my time so I don't get yelled at by Maria, unequal pay for unequal work. There are too many remuneration schemes. Even on the same vessel, you can see people exclusively on a catch share. You can see people getting a fixed wage plus a bonus based on catch. You see people getting a fixed wage and no bonus, or a fixed wage and a set bonus as long as they didn't abscond throughout the year. When you have that diversity of pay on a vessel, what it means is those that are getting paid any way, shape, or form in relation to catch means they're incentivized to keep working. Why would you rest if you can catch more fish and make more money? And so it incentivizes really long working hours for those that are getting paid just a flat fixed wage. Excessive working hours is becoming the norm in the industry. 73% of respondents reported working a minimum of 16 hours per day on average, and 15% said that they normally worked over 20 hours a day. This is again in part due to too many remuneration schemes. It's also a product of environmental climate change, as like we said, fishing longer, further, deeper to maintain yields. And what is rest? Less than a third of respondents reported receiving rest days that would be compliant with ILO C-188's minimum standards. We know for migrants all over the world who are tied to the vessel, they can't leave the vessel when the vessel's in port. Now for fleets that aren't staying in port for a month or two at a time, so the Hawaii Longline Fleet, the UK fleet, they're only in port for a day or two before they may go out again. The migrants are often told that they have to clean, they have to fix the vessel, and they have to paint the vessel, and that's constituted as rest because they're not fishing. Because so much of domestic legislation, working hours is about, are you fishing? But we all know there's a lot of work on a fishing vessel that has nothing to do with catching fish. Even if you are just on watch as the vessel is coming back into port, that may be considered rest. But you're not really resting, are you, if you're up on deck? So a lot of migrant fishers don't actually know, and national fishers too, to be honest, don't know what constitutes work and what constitutes rest, which makes it very difficult to monitor work and rest hours. There's also that domestic legislation could contradict itself. So here in the UK, what is differentiated as work and rest is defined differently by Border Force, the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, and the tax agency, which is really not helpful when they all have different definitions. 84% of fishers earned below the national minimum wage or the ITF minimum wage if there was no national minimum wage for fishers. If you're not familiar, the ITF minimum wage is based on an ILO calculation. So this is accounting for their debt, because we asked fishers how much they're getting paid and how much their debt was. And because of that debt that they carry into the employment, many of them are earning very, very little. So on average, it was $379 US per month, but that monthly income can range drastically across fleets. So we heard everything from $66 per month to $2,300 per month. Average recruitment debt, a ginormous range from $0, which is great, fishers shouldn't be incurring debt to take this work, all the way up to $12,600, and that was for a 2-year contract. So that person is going to really struggle to make enough money in that job to cover that debt. A lot of fishers talked about not having received their wages. And when we calculated what they reported for their monthly wage and how long it had been since they received their wages, because many of them said, I haven't received my wages in 3 months, I haven't received my wages in 2 months. Of course, calculations suggest that other 2,080-something participants over almost $760,000 US in unpaid wages at the moment. We know that this can be a really big barrier for fishers to get off the vessel if they're in an exploitive situation. They don't want to leave if they haven't gotten paid. They don't know how they're going to get that money if they return home. And so we've also seen situations where, I've seen situations where regulators or companies may even say that, oh, that fisher's not being treated that bad. They decided to stay on the vessel. One of the reasons they stay on the vessel is because their wages or their income is really inconsistent. This is particularly true for people on a fixed wage. Food, water, and nutrition on board vessels. This was one of the most interesting findings to me. Food and water is highly racialized, so on vessels with mixed nationalities, we saw lots of differences in the types of food that were given to maybe the senior crew and the skipper, who might be one nationality, and all the other different nationalities. A lot of times you will hear captains or vessel owners say, well, they got fed X because we had a Filipino cook. And so, you know, the Ghanaians might not like what the Filipino cook made. It's just because they eat different food. But if you actually dig into some of the dynamics that the fishers were reporting, it's actually highly racialized. We heard stories of some fishers from Senegal who the captain would throw their food on the ground and told them to eat off the ground because they were animals. Not uncommon. We also heard that food and water is used as a source of control. So you only get food and water if you caught enough fish or you worked hard enough. A couple weeks ago, I was contacted by a Ghanaian fisherman here in the UK. He left me a message where he said he had been denied water for 3 weeks because he wasn't working hard enough. So he kept the freezer door, he propped the freezer door open to create freezer burn that he could chunk off and then he'd boil it to drink it. The other disadvantage is that ILO C-188's requirement is, quote, sufficient quality and quantity of nutritious food and water. It's not operationalized. For working hours, we have clear guidelines about what are the minimum standards for work. So actually we've been in conversation with ILO about how can we start to think about operationalizing and giving really clear guidance about what is sufficient quality and quantity of work. And in combination with the extreme working hours, a lot of fishers are reporting signs of malnutrition, which are only going to increase the safety risk on board vessels. We know that fishing is a very dangerous job, even in the best conditions. So having people who are overworked, who haven't gotten rest, and who are malnourished, is likely leading to those safety issues on board. So 24% reported being injured, and migrants were 12 times more likely to not have an injury reported to authorities than domestic fishers in the sample. Fishers threatened with, you can read all that. I think one of the things that's interesting is around the physical or sexual violence. I was actually enumerating some of the surveys myself in a couple countries, and when we would ask the question about physical violence, a lot of the fishers would ask, is it physical violence if it doesn't leave a mark? And so I'd ask them, you know, has the captain ever punched you or hit you or slapped you? And they would say, oh yeah, but it didn't leave a mark. And so what they consider themselves to be physical violence is actually a pretty high threshold. And of course, reporting to authorities is a means of control. And we've all heard that some of the shouting and insulting on a vessel, that's just fishing work, right? And folks are concerned about complaining. Blacklisting is rampant in the fishing industry. They're very worried about losing their job, loss of their visa, that they might get stuck somewhere, that they're never going to recuperate wages that aren't owed to them, etc. And I think some interesting things about how, especially for the migrant fishers in the global fleet, how are those vulnerabilities exploited? So for a lot of fishers, there's a tension between their present working conditions and future work opportunities. So they may put their head down, and as one fisher said, putting your head down and getting on with it is easier than saying no if you want to work again. So this is the culture of blacklisting, which can be done through recruitment agencies, through skippers, through captains, through other networks in a port. And so they're really worried about losing out on work. A lot of the fishers had a lot of experience fishing. They were born to be fishermen. And so losing fishing work was a big driver for them not to report anything. They also talked about how vessel owners and captains sow division amongst their limited, constrained social networks, further isolating them. So you all know that because you're out there on the docks, you're visiting the ships, you are part of their social network. That's really important. Which I think gets to really important discussion around grievance channels. Increasingly, there's a really big movement led by some more environmentally focused NGOs to have grievance mechanisms at scale, or really large grievance mechanisms. But those grievance mechanisms are never going to work based on our data, because our data told us that you all are who they turn to. You're trusted, you have sight of them, you take away the burden for them to report. Because you're in the docks, you see with your own eyes and ears, you see that they're not making contact, you see something suspicious, and you will reach out to them. And so it's that network that they feel most comfortable reporting a complaint to. And when our sample may have been slightly biased because Stella Morris was helping administer it, but when we asked who you would trust reporting a grievance to, there was a diversity of answers, but the biggest response was Stella Morris. And that's because you're part of their trusted network. And the reason you're trusted, as you all know, is because you helped them build community. You brought them food, you brought them clothing, you brought them SIM cards. And so then they felt comfortable disclosing something which might actually be very shameful to them, to you. So directions forward, where do we go from here? In particular, I loved the question yesterday about how much does it cost to have good recruitment? How much does it cost to have good practices? The reality is, it's really expensive, especially at the bottom of the supply chain. I'm not one to sort of let vessel owners off the hook, but the reality is a lot of initiatives in the sector right now target the vessel owner, and the vessel owners are incurring a lot of financial burden. All that's going to do is to continue to squeeze what fishers are getting paid. I think we need to look at ways to take power and make sure the retailers are financing these things. The retailers are at the top of the supply chain. They have more money and more power than any other actor in the supply chain. So here in the UK, some of you have already met me and my colleagues as we're working our way around the UK, but we're looking at implementing a model called the worker-driven social responsibility, which basically gives preferential market access to vessel owners, and the retailers are paying for the program, and the retailers pay a premium that goes down to the fishers, to the workers at the bottom. This is a model that started in agriculture and has been replicated in garments, dairy, etc. So other sectors that often rely on low-wage workers. Cultural competence in inspections. I think Stella Morris here is one of the world's foremost experts on how to build trust with the workers. I listened to Father Paolo's talk yesterday, which just encapsulated all that. How you build trust with them, how you take time with them. We know that inspections are often very, very short, and that fishers, in the survey we asked about inspections, the fishers disclose, they'll often tell the authorities what they think the authorities want to hear. It's because they don't want their immigration status scrutinized. It's also because the authorities are going to leave, and they're going to be stuck on that vessel with that same crew and that owner still. And how do we continue to set worker-driven standards? So we have ILO C-188. It is an amazing starting point, but there are some clear gaps in it. And it's been a real struggle to get it ratified in a lot of countries. It is, of course, part of the tripartite process, which is great because it centers workers, but continuing to ensure that we have workers at the table. I'm familiar with a lot of initiatives coming out of the environmental space at the moment where they want to add on social considerations to programs that already exist for the environment. Well, that's great. It's never going to work if you don't have fishers at the table, because all that means is we're going to prioritize the environmental standards at the continued expense of what's happening to the fishers. So I promised I would stay at 40 minutes, and I think it's been exactly 40 minutes. So I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Jessica. I think when I said you were in for a treat, that was just a wrong use of words, because this is just so shocking and so terrible. So even though you present it really well, it breaks at least my heart to hear about it. Do we? Yes, please.
Sorry. I actually wrote this down, I forgot to say it. I wanted to share a quote from one of the surveys from a fisher. Stella Maris rescued me. I wanted to jump over and I think about it. I'm alive now because of Stella Maris. So that is the value of
Thank you. So, any questions for Jessica? Yes, here in the middle. And then over there after. And then.
It's Anapinda from Thailand. I saw the wages. Wages only $300. I don't know if it includes the catch shellfish or not. Because catch shellfish will engage with the work long hours. Because of the fishermen need more money. So the work long hours get percent from the catch shellfish. And then after, I think the new size of the human trafficking is in the drug. Did not see the drug in this survey. Because of now we found that they pay wages by drug. They get the people who need the drug and then boarding the fishing vessel and I will pay you by drug, maybe 1,000 baht or something. In my country now we have port in, port out for inspection the fishing vessel, and then they've changed the flag, fly the flag to foreign flag, and then we cannot inspection there. And now they say we have so many fishing vessels was abandoned in Malaysia water, in OPL over port limit, so we cannot do anything. I ask if the IUU engage with the oil government, can you do something with the oil flag state to inspection and help the people get back return home? Because now they have a lot of people strapped on board the fishing vessel.
Yeah, that was one of the things, because we got some of this data during COVID, we had lots of examples of people overstaying their contracts. They got stranded on board the vessel, they got stranded in the port, and it also seems like those examples are being used against others to sort of keep control of them as well, because people were quite fearful of getting stranded on the vessel, getting stranded in port. And yes, talking about all those complexities about the catch share and the payments, we have a lot of data. We have over 200,000 data points, and so this was a very brief summary. But I think what you're talking about, some of that complexity is really important to capture. I also try to talk about this at a very global level, and I think today, to capture some of that complexity, we're going to have to look much like smaller regions, because we see a lot of variation across regions.
Next question.
Over here. Yeah. Is there a mic? There you go.
Hi, my name's Peter from the North East England Tees and Hartlepool. Thanks very much for the presentation, it was excellent. But what it reminded me on the different ones was was it 5 years ago we were in Taiwan, and we heard a really passionate presentation from the ladies from the centre there who will look after fishes. And really talk about the same things, and the violence, exactly what you said, but excellent presentation. And I think it was 10 years ago, my colleague in Cornwall were rescuing fishes off fleets belonging to a fleet in Scotland. How long do we go on? What do we do? What do you want us to take away to change things, and what's the time scale on that? Because we'll go away with heavy hearts listening to all the stuff there. We're frustrated about what we do about it. And as so many organisations, what do we all do to move it forward? I know there's things going on in the UK with regards to levelling up salaries and stuff like that, but I'm going to go home and wait another 5 years for another presentation. Thanks for the presentation. What do you want to do with it?
That's a really, I wish I had a really good answer to that. I think there are lots of colleagues, I'm looking at Pinya from Thailand, who can share examples of successes, I think small successes, I think who are much better versed in those successes than I am. I think one of the takeaways for me when we all started working together in the UK was, you're right, this has been going on since 2008 in the UK. I'm well aware that Bruno, when he speaks to my class, I always love it because my class thinks that these issues in fishing started in 2014 with the Guardian report, and Bruno starts talking about how in the 1970s he saw what he now knows to be forced labor for the first time. These issues have been going on for a long time, and part of it is we lack standards and we're trying to change norms, and norms don't change overnight. I think what was really rewarding for me in the UK was that when we all came together, Stella Maris, some of the charities, myself, for better or worse, it may not be deserved, but being an academic, when I take something to the government, it's seen a little bit differently than sometimes, when ITF takes it to the government. So I think that was the value in the mixed group that we had. I think, those of you in countries where ILO C-188 isn't ratified and can be ratified, because it's a member state of the UN, that would be helpful. But most importantly, I think it's really continuing to make sure that your voices are heard. I've sat in a lot of forums where people just pretend that there's no one out there, not you all, like big environmental NGOs, etc. Just pretend that there's no one out there helping the fishers every single day. And you all are, and we know that. And so I think, Bruno is invited to a lot of spaces, but continuing to not only advocate for the fishers, but also advocate for yourselves. And I know that's really hard because I know most of you are doing so much with very little resources, and you're operating in a really dangerous environment. But you all really are the lifeline to the fishers. That was very obvious, that without you, they feel like they don't have a lot of options in terms of remedy and recourse and even just support. But I welcome any colleagues from countries that have had some successes to please share those, because you all are much better versed than I am. My biggest example is the UK. I can also share one other example. In the Hawaiian longline fleet, we have no visa, so migrant workers are picked up in Mexico because they can't even transit through the US. They're tied to the vessel. It looks a lot like the UK fishing industry, and we actually fought really hard and got a condition where the immigration authorities will investigate a complaint. There's another faith-based ship-visiting ministry there that acts as a buffer so it doesn't get treated as an immigration issue. And between the faith-based ministry, the social worker, and immigration, if that complaint is substantiated, the immigration authorities will move them to a new vessel. So it actually creates good competition. So that would be another example of a small success. Wages are still horrifically low in that fleet though, so it's not all daisies and roses. But again, I invite colleagues who have had great successes as well to share.
There was a question over here. Yeah, you.
Morning, I'm Albert Dampier, I'm from the Seychelles. I don't have a question, but I have a recommendation to make. And this recommendation is, I would like the Stella Maris, all of us present here, we have to see and say whether our government have ratified the conventions, working the fishing convention for fishers, C-188. If our government have not ratified this convention, we should not only lobby, but we should put pressure on our government to ratify this very important convention that will help us to do our work better. Because now we say fishermen, they work for long hours. In the convention they have how many hours fishers should work. So if our government ratify this convention, we will have enough tools to use to fight. Even for them to have better cabin, better sleeping area. But now, I work with fishers every day. When I go on the ship, I look at the living conditions, sleeping conditions is worse. Taiwanese fishing versus South Korean fishing versus Japanese. But if I have tools by our government has ratified this and they are fishing and then a license of Seychelles, fishing license authority. So we have the power to tell them, my friend, you have to change, to treat these workers as human beings, not as slaves. Thank you, and my friend can contribute.
Yes, I am Lindsay Villipan, National Director of OSHUS. I concur with these views. This is the only issue that can solve all these problems. See, the working conditions on both these fishing vessels. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes.
No, please take another one.
Thank you very much. Zach,
They heard me talk.
yeah.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Jess. Thank you very much for that presentation. We met on Saturday morning with the delegation from America regarding the fields, and it was a wonderful opportunity. At that stage as well, I discussed with you Leonard's situation, which we experienced on Wednesday. Abuse, verbal, physical. My point is, I got a really, from a personal point of view, personal point being a poor result, but it was excellent for the fisherman that he got home with his pay, which he wasn't going to get, and he got his flight from his skipper. And that was just because we had to fight with the skipper and the fisherman's mission. We were going to pass it by, but we got the agreement that they would do it. It's sad in my heart that nothing else is done. I got an email, a text from him saying, "I'm fine, sir. I would like to thank you for helping me. Thank you very much for the kindness you gave me when I was struggling." Yes, they're trusting us, but we're letting them down in how they come into this country, how they're abused, and what happens thereafter. What can we do?
Gosh, I could stop getting asked that question. No, I think that's actually a fantastic example that you all are that first line, but you all don't have to do it on your own. You're part of pushing on those bigger structures like regulations and governments. Like our chaplain from the Seychelles said, absolutely you're instrumental to doing that. But you don't have to do it alone. It's finding those other organizations that are going to help you push on those structural and root issues to expand your capacity. And I was a former social worker for a decade, and I burnt out. I really appreciated Father Paolo's comment about who's taking care of you all, because that's often on the front of my mind. But at the same time, I think we have to remember that we have to center what the fishers want, and that can often feel very disappointing to us. And so how can we make sure that they get the remedy or recourse that they want and satisfactory to them ending while we continue to push on those structures to try and prevent it? I think right now, Stella Maris does a phenomenal job of responding. But at some point, we have to collectively figure out how do we move from response to prevention? Because otherwise, it's just moving from one ship on fire to another ship on fire. And I do agree that 188 is not perfect, but it does give a set of tools. It certainly has not been perfect in the UK at all, but it does give a set of tools, and it starts creating conversations around norms about working hours, etc. So again, it's not a perfect fix, but I think it's a start.
Okay, I have a long list of you and you and you and you, and I know you all want to ask questions, but Father Bruno has said no, we need to move on. But I'm sorry, but Jessica is here, and can I just say, I know you all want to ask questions, but Jessica's here, and we will have time during lunch to talk to her, so please. We need to move on to the next panel, which is, you have spoken about, and we have all spoken about, the caring for ourselves and caring for people, and how hard that can sometimes be. But as church, we do have the best psychosocial tool in the world, because we have faith, we have prayer, and that is, I think, what the next panel is all about. So please, can you, let's give Jessica a big hand.
Jessica, she always speaks Stella Maris does, you do, but she doesn't realize that she's also Stella Maris. Thank you, Jessica.